Thank you all for joining us. We're so pleased to be here with Henerique Dubugras, who is the founder of BREX. Can I get a show of hands? Who's heard of BREX? Great, so congratulations.
It's been getting better year after year.
It is getting better year after year. So Henerique has moved here from Brazil to start this company. And I always think that the journey is probably the most interesting part of the story. Would you tell us what made you move here, what made you start this, and kind of, how you first got into tech?
For sure. So happy to tell a little bit of the story of, kind of how we got into tech and how we started BREX. So I'm originally born and raised in Brazil, in a city close to São Paulo. And I was fortunate that I started coding super early when I was 12 because there was a game I wanted to play, and it was a paid game. And my mom, I asked her to pay it for me, and she said no. So I figured out if I learned how to code, I could play it for free. And that's kind of how I got into coding. And then I built this private server of this game that was exactly like the original one, but instead of charging a monthly fee, I kind of let people play for free and charge for items inside the game, so kind of like a freemium model. They got super popular in Brazil. But after 6 months, I got these legal notifications saying I was breaking some sort of patents. I didn't know what patents were, but my mom got super upset and told me to shut everything off. So that's kind of how I got into tech, and I have made some good money from that. And then I started watching, so I didn't know what to do with my life. I was having this 14-year-old crisis. And I started watching these TV shows. There's this TV show called Chuck. That was a really good computer hacker and programmer. And Chuck, he kind of ran around the world, saving the world of code. He worked for the CIA and had this awesome life. And Chuck had gone to Stanford. And I was like, I want to be exactly like Chuck, so I need to go to Stanford. And I found this Brazilian guy that was graduating from Stanford. And we made this deal in which he would teach me the Stanford application process because it's hard for Brazilians to know the whole US application process. In exchange, I would code his startup for free. So it turns out it was a great deal for both of us. And he raised a couple $1 million, and that's kind of how I got into startups. And then after a year, I left and tried to start my own startup and failed miserably. And then I went to do this hackathon that was worth $50,000. And then I built this app there called Ask Me Out, which is like Tinder, but instead of geolocation, it was Facebook friends. You could like and match your Facebook friends. And from that, we tried to launch that in Brazil, and it failed as well. But it's kind of how I got into payments because we had to kind of implement this payment system in this Tinder-like app, to charge people to know who their match was. And I saw it was a pretty broken system. And around that time, I met my co-founder, Pedro. And Pedro, he started coding when he was 9, and he worked at a payments company. And we met over Twitter in the end of 2012, basically fighting text editors, Vim versus Emacs, which are two kind of, text editors that, it's like soccer teams, there's one that are good, other ones that are bad. I was one called Vim that was really good, and he was one called Emacs that was really bad. And we started fighting on Twitter. It got complicated to fight over 140 characters. We went to Skype. On Skype, we became good friends and decided to start our first company together called Pagarme. And Pagarme was the easiest way to describe is probably like Stripe here in the US, but in Brazil. So we process payments for online merchants that wanted, to accept credit card and other payment methods. And we raised, that company, thank God, worked. So we raised $300,000 for it and then grew from the two of us to a little bit over 150 people, $1.5 billion in transaction volume, and then sold it after 3.5 years to a larger merchant acquirer. Because basically, we were online, they were offline. They wanted to have an online arm, so they acquired our company. And we sold it for a few reasons, but one of them, we had gotten into Stanford, and we kind of wanted to check college out. And two is, we always thought that we could build something really big here in Silicon Valley, so we always kind of saw, Red Tech Crunch, and I imagine how the Silicon Valley place is. So we kind of wanted to check it out. So we sold the company, moved here. Went to Stanford for a little bit, and then after a few months, we decided to drop out and start BREX. That's the fast version of the story, but...
like I said, it's very interesting, the journey. So what I always find really interesting when I chat with you is that you were a founder several times before you even got to Stanford, and here we see most people go to Stanford and then become founders. Now that you've done it on both sides, how does it compare in Brazil or emerging markets versus starting a company here? And kind of what is the thought process behind that? Do you think companies here are just bigger by virtue of the market? Is it more the ecosystem? Was the Stanford experience necessary? Was it just a good place to check out for a few months? You weren't there very long.
Yeah. So this is what I'd say. The biggest differences between starting a company in the U.S. versus, I would imagine any emerging market, or most places in the world, I would say besides China, is there are three main differences. The first one is around executives. So when you're growing from, 2 to 100 to 500 to 1,000 to 2,000, 3,000, like that speed of growth, there are very few people in the world that saw that speed of growth, right? And most of those people are in Silicon Valley because it's just the place where the most startups are. So when I was starting Pagarme, I remember I needed to hire someone that was really good in B2B marketing. And there was 3 people in the whole market, that knew how to do SaaS B2B marketing. And then here in the US, we ran a search and there's 100 of them, so, and all types and shapes and scales. So, and then what happened is we hired someone, but that person still kind of had to figure out what to do. And then when we hired someone here, they kind of knew exactly what to do, So everything was so much faster and we could scale so much faster because of the executive talent that there is here in Silicon Valley. And people say a lot about the engineering, and I agree that there's some specific types of engineering, really deep tech engineering that it's really hard to find elsewhere besides here. But, most regular engineering, if it's just work, you can do for most places. Is the executives, that's the big difference.
And how do you attract them? So when you were first BREX, before most of the room knew what BREX was, how would you convince this awesome executive talent to join you? What was the biggest selling point?
So one thing about Silicon Valley is it kind of seems like this super open place where you can just come in and, make it. And it's actually pretty close. Silicon Valley people, they like their own brands and their own community, So you asked me if Stanford is useful. It was great because Silicon Valley people love Stanford, They love, even though I spent 6 months there, it opened a lot of doors. And then there's Y Combinator, which Silicon Valley people also love, and we went to Y Combinator. So all these things, they start adding up a little bit. And it helps if you have a lot of these points of validation that Silicon Valley kind of values. It helps a lot in recruiting executives.
So you hire all these executive people and you grow your company. You go from, a year ago you were 100 people, now you're almost 500.
Yeah.
How is that? Have you become an HR manager? Are you still an entrepreneur most of your day?
So the biggest thing that changes when the company scales, especially this quickly, is and someone told me, if you can make everyone in your company 5% more productive, that is worth more than any kind of individual work you do, And that's probably not true at 80 people. With 80 people, sometimes you have a lot more context, and if you spend, one night doing something that's really hard, a lot of times that adds value. At 400, there's very few things that, it adds more value than you preparing a really good all-hands meeting, Or you thinking about decision-making processes and these things that scale, and because people are making all these decisions. So the job changes a lot, and you have to think more about how to do things through the people and culture, and there's no way of kind of just doing it yourself anymore.
Do you still know everybody's name?
No, very far from it. Probably stopped at 120 or something like that.
And do you feel like that's changed your relationship with BREX at all? That now you get into an elevator and you don't know if the person who gets in next to you works for your company or not?
Yeah, so you have to kind of create these systems to get to know people in the company, and so everyone kind of feels connected to you, and how do you get connected with them? So, one of the things that I do now is I send this bi-weekly, video. I call it HD and HD, which is, my last name and surname, and I send it in HD. So
that's awesome.
So the team thought it was funny.
So I think the audience thinks it's funny too.
Thank you.
So what is this video?
It's basically things that are top of mind for me, and messages I want to come across that are super important, and things we're changing, or some general updates. But it's more important than the content itself. It's just a way for the company to connect with you, because before you were in the room, you were talking to everyone. Now we have 4 offices. I kind of travel between them, but there's people who never see me in person. So how do you kind of start connecting with the company is a lot of work.
So you've gone from vision, this is what I want to do. You got an incredible amount of funding. You were the fastest ever unicorn in the Valley. You've built the product that you dreamed of. You're now running an organization rather than in founder mode most of your time. What's next?
So I think, one of the biggest things that still has to be is like, we really want to like change this industry, right? Like in the beginning, you start a startup, for those entrepreneurs here, you just don't want to die. That's like your main goal, you just like, you don't want to have to go back to everyone and tell like, this didn't work. I'm doing anything else. So that's kind of like mode one. And then you're having a little bit of success and you're like, okay, like I just want to hang on to this. This looks great, right? And then when, you kind of have and it changes, and this changes from like, early stage, fundraising, from late stage fundraising. When you get to a point where you have some scale, like everyone is willing to fund you. The only thing is like which price, right? So at some price, like most people are willing to fund BREX. It's different than early stage, which, some ideas, even at the zero valuation, no one's willing to, no, zero maybe, get free equity maybe, but like, a lot of people are not willing to fund you. I think it's similarly, like we don't think BREX is going to go to like zero. I think there's a smaller chance of that happening. But we want to think about like how can we maximize our impact and how can we realize the full potential of what we could be? How can we actually like change this, banking and payments industry for the rest of our generation versus just building a company?
So how are you going to do that? You have a new product.
Yeah, so BREX, we started with, our first product was a corporate credit card, right? So, you're a startup in Silicon Valley. Is there any BREX customers here by any chance? Oh, more than I expect too. That's also growing. So basically, as some of you know, it's a corporate card. You can sign up, no personal guarantee, great rewards, great usability, better than other cards. And that's like for us stage one, right? Then stage two was we launched recently BREX Cash, which is our cash management account, which can fully replace your bank account. So you can do all types of payments from wires, checks, ACH, international wires, everything from one single account. So now with BREX Card and BREX Cash, like no matter what you want to pay, you can do it from one single place. And the different thing that we built there is that we rebuilt from scratch all the software powering this. We don't have any kind of legacy system. So the next step for us is now what can we build on top of it that without the legacy systems allows us to do in a much better way, right? So can we build like better expense management solutions or better, purchasing solutions, whatever it is that now we can build on top of our existing platform.
So the vision is that in 10 years or 5 years, or in your case, maybe 2 years, there will be a product for any SME to have the full suite of financial services and accounting and expense management that they need, and that's what you're building.
Exactly.
So what do you think, looking forward, if that's where the industry is going, what do you think are the biggest challenges? Regulatory, talent, the big banks taking business away from them?
Yeah, I think, the awesome
we love our sponsors, by the way. Thank you, SVBs.
The awesome thing about fintech is like, if you think about just the US, there are 44 banks in the US that are over $10 billion each in market cap. Think about that. There are 44 companies that kind of do the same thing, and they're worth more than $10 billion. So I think there's like a lot of market share for a lot of people. So when people ask me, oh, what do you think about competition? It's like, it's obviously annoying, but it's not what's gonna make or break BREX. We're kind of like running in our own lane. I think the biggest challenge is how do you like not spread yourself too thin? So what happens when you start having a lot of people in the company is that a lot of ideas start showing up, right? And you have like all these great ideas and you're like, oh, if I could just execute on all of them, but you don't have any time or resources to do that. So you need to pick a few and be very focused. And that's actually harder than it seems. Like saying no when there's like a lot of good ideas and a lot of resources and a lot of money is like hard. You need to be very disciplined about saying, hey, these are the key things we want to achieve this year. And we're okay missing all these other opportunities to achieve these, these key things.
So I used to have a professor who used to say that the key to success is focus and the key to focus is saying no.
Yeah.
That's always the advice I give to founders. What's the advice you give to all the founders here before we leave the stage, as they're thinking about what their vision is and how they get started and their journey ahead?
So our first value of BREX is dream big. And we kind of had this since early on because of some of our mentors, but everything in your startup life will be easier if you have a big dream and you have a big vision and a big mission. It's easier to attract talent, it's easier to fundraise, it's easier to do everything if you can get whatever product you're building today and you can articulate how gets that to you to a big dream and a big vision, and you can kind of like lay out the steps. Everything in your startup life will be much easier. So I would spend some time doing that as well as just working on the product.
Great. Thank you so much. If we can all thank Henerique for being here.
Thank you so much.